I want to introduce Chris, who is going to be the moderator of our next panel, and he will introduce his panel. But before that panel starts, I want to thank Your Honor for your comments. I took three very important things from that. And one is that the judge is out there talking to kids. And we should be out there, every one of us, talking to kids. We should be doing this. It's so incredibly important. The second thing that I got out of it is sad that only 4 school districts showed up. And our schools have to start taking civics a lot more seriously. I don't mean that to be a condemnation or to imply that all schools are not taking it seriously, but we've really got to make this a priority. And the third thing I learned is that pizza works. So Chris Riano is here.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Mr. President. And if all of my panelists can come up and join me for what I'm very excited about today, which is our national panel on an overview of how civic education works in America. And as everybody comes up, I think one of the things that I think will become very apparent that is not always apparent to those who don't see us as much as we see each other is that we, the group that is coming up here and all the other leadership in the civic education space get along at a degree that is very surprising, I think, to outsiders. We've known each other and been on panels together for many, many years, so much so that this is a much less planned conversation and a little bit more of a on-the-fly conversation, which is what we're best at, I think. And it really is truly wonderful to be up here with the leaders from national organizations that, as much as we may have differences of opinion on how to approach civics, and I think that's a good thing, because I think we each model intellectual humility in our approach, knowing that it's by working together that we can have an impact, not by working cross purposes. And I think we try to model that as the leaders of the civic education space. And I would love to see that in more spaces, because I think it's really unique. But before we really kick this off, I think, if anything, Emma, do you want to give a brief introduction, and we'll just go down the row, and then from there we will get started.
Sure, yeah. Hi, friends. My name is Emma Humphries. I'm the Chief Education Officer at iCivics. We were founded by Justice Sandra Day O'Connor in 2010 to reimagine civic education for the next generation.
Good morning, everyone. Andrew Wilkes, Chief Policy and Advocacy Officer at Generation Citizen, and thrilled to be with you all today.
Hi, everyone. My name is Verneé Green, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Mikva Challenge. Mikva Challenge was named after Judge Abner Mikva, who actually served in all 3 branches of government.
I'm David Bobb, President and CEO of the Bill of Rights Institute. For 25 years, we've taught civics, supporting a national network of teachers with free digital resources and professional learning programs.
Excellent. And just as a little context, I'm the outgoing president for the Center for Civic Education, and I think one of the things that I'm really excited about is this is one of my final opportunities in my position to really work with my colleagues here. And I really do want to kick it off with a pretty broad question, because I think each of us thinks of this broad question every single day, and I'm curious to get people's thoughts. And Emma, I'm going to start with you, only
Sure.
because we've talked about this before. We do all approach this a little differently. And I think it's that diversity of approaches that creates this richness that helps us reach so many people across the country. But can you briefly describe how you would think of iCivics and how you would think of the work you do in the position that reaches so many millions of K through 12 children and others throughout the year, that makes it really important to you as an educator?
Yeah, sure. And Chris, it's so exciting for me and so fun for me to be on this panel with you. Perhaps one last time, although I'm not sad because your successor is awesome. We hate to see you go, but we're so excited about Donna Phillips taking your place. So I work for iCivics. We're a provider at scale. We create really fun, engaging, effective, standards-based, nonpartisan, and accurate civic learning materials. And I think the best way to exemplify our reach in what we do is to just tell you about a conversation I had over the bagels this morning with one of our high school students who said, You're with iCivics, do you make the games? I don't, but I'm proud to be part of the team that does. I'm an educator. I cut my teeth as a high school social studies teacher in North Central Florida. But this happens a lot. And what's really neat is now that we've been around for as long as we have, about 14 years, this happens with adults. I was checking into a hotel in Philadelphia a few weeks ago, and a young woman who was at least 25 said, "Oh, I know iCivics." So we provide free resources online at scale, and that's sort of how we're able to move the needle. And it's really fun for me to talk with folks who have a very different and oftentimes more in-depth approach, and they're sharing the panel with me. We also, importantly, and I'll talk more about this later in our discussion, we lead a policy effort called Civics Now, pushing for more and better civic education at the state and federal level. But what we truly believe, and I think my friends on this panel share this thought, is it's all hands on deck. We need each other, we need all these organizations, we need all of you. There's no room for infighting or thinking one's way is the best way. We need more and better civic education. Our democracy depends on it.
I think that was excellent. And it actually makes me think, David, from your perspective, a similar question. I think you have been the head of an organization the longest out of the group of us. And so you've seen the landscape and also seen how it's changed in many ways. What's your perspective on how national organizations and your organization is really looking at how a civic education can make an incredible difference at K through 12, but really at any age, like Emma was talking about?
Well, thank you, Chris, and thanks for your service to this this work, and for everybody here, your being here. I think the thing that I've noticed over the last decade is that during that time, I've gone from, if I would mention civics or the line of work that I'm in, people would say, "Oh, we need that," but you felt like it was kind of lip service. Today, we feel the need. We know it. We really don't have to go into communities all across this state and this country and explain the need in a way, because neighbors are not having the same conversations that they used to. 56% of high school students, according to a Knight Foundation study done nationally, reported recently that they feel comfortable disagreeing with their peers in the classroom. That means that 2 out of 5 do not. And as President Lewis said this morning, returning to that place where we can have those hard conversations, recognizing that the Constitution is a means for managing disagreement, not eliminating it, is absolutely vital. So I think in a way, while things are troublesome, the other thing that I'll just note is that every year, and I think you're right to cite some of those woeful statistics about how little we know as a people, the implication can kind of be like, well, what's wrong with the teenagers today? Why don't they get it? Why don't young people come naturally to this thing and know the 3 branches of government? And I wonder, what's wrong with us as adults that we can't model this better? Because after all, the best way to teach is to model. And we need to give examples over and over again, going out into the community, bringing students to your institutions, showing them that we can disagree without going for the jugular, without trying to defeat, without looking at each other as enemies. And so I think it's a high calling. I come to this forum with optimism. We have 3,600 teachers that are in this state that we support. And I think the most important thing that we can do as members of the community is to come alongside educators and to reinforce the importance of viewpoint diversity in the classroom, that they feel empowered to challenge students with different perspectives, and that those students would come away having internalized that.
I think that is an excellent way to think about one of the core pieces of the work and managing disagreement. I mean, when you think about it, I think of many times that those of us up here have had interesting debates ourselves, right? And yet it's been fantastic because it's always in the light of trying to get to this more firm grasp on what we do agree on. And I think that modeling that is really important. Verneé, you and I are the new folks in many ways, right? And I've always been very proud of that because you and I have kind of experienced so many different things together. Our phone calls have always been so unique, and I love that. And in that vein, and seeing things from the perspective that you've had both in the classroom and then now moving up into leadership. What's your kind of takeaway on the moment where we're at nationally, where we all have, I think, more wind behind us, but all of us, I think, would agree that if tomorrow another $100 million just fell out of the sky, we still wouldn't be able to do what we need to do. There's so much work that we need to be doing.
Yeah. I think, so as Chris mentioned, I am a former teacher. I was a middle school social studies teacher, and a lot actually, and I don't see her, Judge D'Agostino talked about, I was like, yes, I did that in my classroom. I made sure that the classroom was relevant, that we took field trips, that the discussions were relevant. My students analyzed political cartoons. It was really exciting. And now, fast forward, I've been out of the classroom over 20 years, those young people are attorneys, those young people are community organizers, those young people, actually there's one who's an executive director of an organization in this state who was a first generation Mexican-American student who didn't even think about what this country meant to her and that she had some opportunities. I think because I had that experience and now leading an organization that right now serves about 400,000 students, about 100,000 in this state, it's exciting to think about what was done at the sort of micro level in my classroom and what's possible to do across this country, and really inspiring young people to, and we talk about this a lot in our two organizations, learning democracy by doing democracy. It has to be real and relevant. Young people have phones at their disposal. They are getting information in constantly. They're seeing things. So we cannot limit education to a textbook. It just cannot be, because the rest of their world is very, very different. And so finding ways to think about the things that I was able to do in my classroom and bring that to a larger scale is something I'm really excited about being a leader at this time. Another thing, I'm very clearly a woman of color. A lot of people that we serve, a lot of the young people that we serve have really honestly felt left out of some of those founding documents and texts. And we have to make sure, I've had people say, well, let's just teach, the Constitution and that's it. And I'm like, oh, if I'm a seventh grader analyzing the Constitution, I know that I was 3/5 of a person. And that doesn't feel good to me as I am thinking about how this work means something to me. So we actually, in our work, take our young people, again, learning democracy by doing democracy, give them a space to kind of pick apart and have really hard conversations and talk across difference. We create opportunities where young people from upper state Michigan are able to talk to young people from New York City, maybe in ways that they never would have been able to before, because our schools aren't set up that way. Our teachers aren't, not our teachers, our cities aren't set up in that way. They're very segregated. And so young people don't have the opportunity to talk to someone who may have a difference of opinion. And so one thing I'm really proud of about our work is that we find ways to bring young people together, encourage them to talk across difference, and hopefully that 56% or 52% people who are scared, that number will increase and grow through our young people. So being a little bolder and a little braver, I will say some of us have been complicit, and I will admit my role in that, in thinking about, oh, we've just got to do it this really narrow way. Young people are bold. They're bold, they're courageous, they don't want to do things the way we've always done it. So finding ways that we as an organization are evolving. We're a 25-year-old organization, but we're continuing to evolve because the young people are forcing us to, and actually our country needs us to.
It was beautiful, and I think it also dovetails with something that, Emma, you mentioned earlier. I think one thing that we've all experienced, whether we've wanted to or not, is even if there's often in many people's minds this focus in the K-12 environment, I'm pretty sure if I said, have we not all had an adult conversation with somebody at some point in time where all of our K-12 skills have come out, and we've had the exact same conversation, because people are really, really interested and hungry to have places they can go to get nonpartisan, like I always call it the nonpartisan toolkit, to analyze what's going on. And Andrew, I'd like to hear your thoughts a little bit. One of the things that I love about the organization that you work for, and certainly feel free to say more, is that there's a very, I think, purposeful approach to ensuring that education is getting into classrooms that are all over the country. And I think that's something that we all share, but I also think it's something that your organization does particularly well. And I think that's one of the things that sometimes gets missed in the conversation. All of us work across the country. We have been on panels together in multiple states around the world, around the country. And I think, Andrew, your organization does a great job at that. I'd love to hear more about how that has influenced your national view on where civics is, but where civics can really go.
Yeah, really appreciate the question. Where civics is and where civics can go. Sometimes repeating things for me helps me to stay on track. So Generation Citizen is an organization that was founded by a college student, and Generation Citizen really emphasizes the importance of youth voice, generational equity, and how age diversity is actually a resource that helps to strengthen the practice of informed participatory democracy. Our organization, like that of my colleagues up here, is active all over the country, in the New England region, in the Mid-Atlantic region, up and down the Atlantic seaboard, in the West, and also in the South. And a part of what we see in terms of what civics is and where civics can go is the beauty and the power of what we call community-based action civics, when students can have candid and courageous conversations about issues that they select. Whether that's mental health, whether that's the experience of a democratic classroom, lowercase d, whether that is them choosing issues of housing or greater access to green space. There's a surprising similarity in what students are choosing across regions. And one of the themes that I'll lift up here is students want to know that their voices matter and that their voices can make a difference in how school decisions are made and how they experience and engage with local government. I'll lift up one brief quote, which I think encapsulates the power of action civics. I see there's a Martin Luther King Jr. quote right there, so I'll bring the good Dr. King into the room. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said that democracy transformed from thin paper into thick action can be one of the greatest forms of government on the planet. And we really try to create opportunities for students to engage in action with their local governments, believing that action contains its own kind of instructional value, and that when you learn by doing, as my colleague Verneé said, it really helps to create a sense of civic confidence and a sense of collective self-efficacy, that students' voice not only matters, but it can be efficacious and lead to effective community problem solving in the public square.
I love that. That was amazing, and exactly what I think we're all trying to do at this national scale. And I want to come back to something because I'm curious to hear folks' thoughts. David, you said in some ways that you felt that there has been a sea change, that people are paying more attention, that there has been a translation to and I think these were my words, more wind in the sails, but that only has taken us so far. What are some of those things that you may have seen that have shifted in recent years, and where do you think we need to keep going when it comes to that with some of the, I'd say, field building that we're all attempting to do together?
Yeah, I think, Verneé, you said something that I think speaks to one of the very important things for us to consider today about how you felt and how you feel and how young people feel about the Constitution. Fast forward to July 4th, 2026. On that day, the United States of America will turn 250 years old. What's our next 250 years going to be? Do we have another 250 years? What's the next 100 look like? I think of a speech that was given when the United States of America was turning 76 years old. It was on July 5th, 1852, and it was given by Frederick Douglass. And it was perhaps the greatest speech that's been given in American history. What to the slave is the 4th of July. And in that speech, Douglass starts by speaking as an outsider. You, he said to his audience in Rochester, in this state, you, not us. He was alienated from the Constitution. from the country. And I think we have to recognize that a lot of our fellow citizens feel that today. They don't feel a part of anything that might be called the American dream. They wonder if they can ever be a part of that. And what I would say to you today, if you haven't had a chance to read this speech, it's beautiful because it starts with indignation, a righteous anger that says, how can I celebrate this thing when you have enslaved me and millions of others? And yet he points to the Declaration of Independence. And he says, that thing gives us something that no other gift could ever be like, and that is saving principles. That's his term. Freedom and equality for all. And he says we can't forget the plight of African Americans. We can't forgive even those injustices that still remain because we have to fix them. But the way to fix them is to fix them by appealing to the principles, to those saving principles. And so what I hope we can come to realize in this moment of need is that we do have the resources within our history and our civic engagement to be able to fix what now is wrong. And I think if we keep our eye on those saving principles and think in a way that's very practical about how do we build out those models, not just in our schools, in our places of work, in so many other parts of life, there's a real opportunity to draw people back to that idea of the saving principles.
Chris, do you mind if I
Oh,
just
please,
jump in really?
please.
Because as I'm listening to this conversation and listening to your question, it's also just reminding me that we've not made civics a priority. Like the only way for us to have some real change is one, simple, we make sure civics education is taught, and it is taught at multiple grade levels, and it is taught often. It is not a priority. We don't invest the financial resources at a state level to make sure that there are materials, that there is curriculum. We all have curriculum that we are able to provide to schools, and schools sometimes struggle to figure out when they can fit it in because it's not necessarily a priority. In order to be where we need to be in this country, we've got to know that this is a long game. It's an election year, so everybody's talking about civics right now. It's an election year every year. There's some type of election that is happening. So we should be teaching civics all the time, not just every 4 years. So we get a lot of calls to speak and talk and share our materials, but it's that lack of investment at multiple grade levels every year that is part of the problem. So we've got this problem because we're not playing the long game. I think, and getting back to your question, what do we need to do and what can folk in this room do is really help us to make civics education as much a priority. And I'm a STEM girl, sure, I like math and science, but that has been a priority, and it has actually pushed civics aside. When I was teaching again 20 years ago, no one cared what I taught. It wasn't even tested. They didn't care. I could have been doing anything. But I made it a priority for me. The other piece I will say in this political climate makes it very difficult. In addition to carving out room for civics, we've got to equip teachers with the tools, not only to teach the content, but to feel safe in having difficult conversations. Teachers are under attack in this country. People are zooming in on what are you saying in your classroom that may be controversial. Also, teachers need the tools to manage those different conversations, because if adults can't talk across difference, how are we supporting young people to talk across difference? So all of us offer curriculum. We also offer professional development for teachers, and I will say, just like teachers say, our schools say, we don't have time for field trips, we've had schools say, we don't have time for professional development for teachers. So there aren't PD days where we can bring teams in to say, here's our curriculum, let's model for you what happens if a student says X, or if a parent calls you with Y. Let's model and practice those conversations, because we've had teachers who'll say, I'll skip over that hard lesson. I'll skip over that controversial lesson because it's hard, it's too hard for me to do. So one, I would just to summarize that, create space for us to talk, for curriculum to take place, and also create space for that training for teachers, and supporting teachers is important.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in as Verneé's got me all fired up. I'm an optimist because we have no choice. So here's the good news. You're going to hear a lot of bad news, and that's fair because the stakes are really high and we're really in bad shape. I do not want to understate that. But here's the good news. Since 2021, 23 states have enacted more than 30 measures to strengthen K-12 civic education. When Chris says there's wind in our sails, he's not kidding. Better yet, we are currently tracking 141 civic education-related bills in 35 states, 100 of which are aligned to the Civics Now, that is our policy arm, state policy menu, what we believe are best practices for promoting civic education. Of those 141, best I can tell is 2 of them are here in New York State, one of which would require instruction in civics in grades 5 through 12. That's awesome. Of course, it's sitting in committee, but there's powerful people in this room, see what you can do. Because that bill would be a huge improvement over the just one semester of civics that is currently required in New York State. By the way, that's in high school. It's probably in 12th grade. Imagine the number of students who drop out and never get to that course, who are arguably the students who need it the most. So how do you make that happen? So I have a really great story. So I spent 37 years in Florida. I'm a Floridian. You've all heard of it. Being New Yorkers, you've heard of the state of Florida. For the high school kids in the room, that's where your great-grandparents retired, but your grandparents and your parents are having second thoughts. Anyways, Florida's a very interesting state for a number of reasons, but it is the leader in civic education. I'm excited to tell you why, but it's also a little somber today because in the span of 6 months, I lost 2 of my heroes in civic education. First, Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, founder of iCivics, and yes, first female Supreme Court justice. She, by the way, wants to be known for being the founder of iCivics. We lost her in December, and then just 6 months later, we lost former Florida Governor and U.S. Senator Bob Graham, for whom I worked for 5 years. I want to tell you about them, and the reason they're my heroes, for a lot of reasons. They're incredible people, beloved people across the political spectrum, but they're the heroes of civic education in Florida. So in 2007, Bob Graham joined forces with retired Republican, Bob Graham's a Democrat, retired Republican state legislator Lou Frye to start promoting a civic education bill in Florida. It went nowhere, it went nowhere, it went nowhere until in 2010, Justice Sandra Day O'Connor visited the Florida legislature, gave them a talking to in a way that female justices and judges seem to know how, and they unanimously passed the Justice Sandra Day O'Connor Civic Education Act, requiring at least 1 semester of civics in middle school. Most counties spend a full year, and an end-of-course exam. Overnight, students in Florida started learning civics. We need that to happen in more states. We have seen that happen since. We've seen it happen in Indiana. We've seen it happen in Massachusetts. I'd really love to see it happen here in Florida. Google Bob Graham, Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, read the whole story and see what you can glean from that story to make that happen here. Who are your Bob Grahams? Who are your Sandra Day O'Connors? They're harder to find these days. It's harder to find folks who are beloved across the spectrum because we are so fractured. But as I often remember, to be fractured and polarized is to be American. We've always been this way. This is nothing new. Sure, it's harsher now, but we can do this. We have to do this. We're all fighting. I know I'm preaching to the choir, but I just want to hopefully provide a little bit of inspiration and practical advice on how to push this forward.
I want to continue the good news train that my dear colleague has shared by noting how deep and intentional the collaboration is. For most of, I've been working in the civics education space since 2017. From 2017 to about 2020, about $3 to no more than $5 million had been allocated to 2 federal civics education programs, American History and Civics Education National Academies Program 1, and then 2 American History and Civics Education National Activities Programs. From about 2021 to 2024, the most recent fiscal year, the funding has jumped up to about $23 million, and that's because our colleagues at iCivics has really helped to lead the charge, advocating for more appropriations for civics education, and that's something that all of our organizations, as well as other organizations that are not here, have helped to really put their shoulder to the wheel to secure that money. While it's not all that we might want to see relative to opportunity and need, it's a solid step in the right direction. So even in a polarized, challenging environment, there's a lot of momentum to make. Want to make another observation that I'll lift up. There was a report by the National Academy of Education called Online Civic Reasoning and Discourse. And in part, they argue that civics education, when culturally relevant and when equitable, this is my paraphrase, but hopefully it's a responsible paraphrase, should address structural inequality, migration, and violence. Now, we typically think about civics education as enumerating rights and responsibilities, and we should, because that's critical, it's cardinal, it's central to the work of democracy. But civic learning inequality is something that we're each trying to address to make sure that there's more instructional time, teachers have more funding for professional development, to make sure that civics education is something students in all kinds of districts can access, metropolitan, rural, suburban, et cetera. The second piece, migration, I think speaks to civics not presuming homogeneity, but rather valuing heterogeneity, diversity, difference in the population. America's public schools have long been the kind of at the vanguard, right? Majority BIPOC in ways that other institutions, be they in the private sector, nonprofit, public sector, are kind of grappling and groping with how do we manage difference in a constructive way. And so civics that speaks to first-generation students, speaks to those who have recently migrated within the country and come from other countries, is a part of what equitable civics entails. But the last piece I think is particularly important. What does civics education do in the face and in the specter of violence, right? Questions of war and peace, which I just have to allude to because it's been all over our headlines, has it not? Right? Civics not only helps us to deal with those questions in a way that manages dissent and dissonance with grace, with candor, and with hearable conversation, but it also, and this is what I value about the unity of approaches that we do here, tech and games, community-based action civics, and having holistic conversations about the Bill of Rights and practice, is that civics helps to have deliberation that avoids ad hominems, avoids gaslighting, avoids shouting matches, and instead figures out how can we listen as an art, and how can we source and express our claims in ways that expand the Venn diagram of agreement so that we can get stuff done.
As I alluded to before, I don't need to moderate this conversation because we all do really get along very well. That was beautiful. Everybody said so many beautiful things, and one of the things that's sticking with me, and this is one of the things I want to make sure we talk about, when it comes to being inclusive, and each of our organizations does this, I think folks, and I know that we're going to have more talk about New York later, I think folks would be surprised if they actually learned where we find strength in our field. I know we just talked about Florida. I could talk about Indiana. I could talk about Oklahoma. We could. It's not places that people necessarily would think, because this is a unifying force. That's what's staggering. That's what's always struck me, is that there are far more ways that this brings people together than separates. And to a point that was just mentioned, our 250th year anniversary of this experiment is coming up, and this is still an experiment. And I come from a family of RPI engineers, so I will say this. Everybody in my family is an engineer. I'm the only lawyer. Engineering matters, science matters, math matters. We'd all agree, but we can't get to the moon if we don't have stable government. It just doesn't happen. We can't invent the cure for cancer if we can't find ways to talk through differences. And I want to spend a little bit of time on something that's been brought up, but I think is important. There is this unique federal-state interplay. It's because of the way the system is designed. We all know that. The system is designed, it makes it particularly unique and challenging for each of us. How do we feel about that? Where is the most movement nationally? Do we see it at the state level, at the federal level? And where do we all play a role in that? Emma, I see you're shaking your head, so I don't know if you wanted to go first.
Yeah, I'll just chime in to say briefly, we're seeing the most action at the state level, and as we've grown our policy team, we've been hiring more state-level directors. You need the boots on the ground, as you will. Anyone here who has legislative work knows. We have had some good bipartisan action at the federal level, but it has stalled out. There's something called the Civic Secures Democracy Act. We hope to reinvigorate it. We hope to sort of breathe some more life into it in the future, but it's a really tough thing to pass. So the state level is where it's at, and as it should be. We have a federal system. Show me 50 state systems of education, and I've seen 50 state systems of education. Drill down to the district level, the same is true. I think the states should be left to decide how and when they teach their kids civics, as long as they're teaching their kids civics. And to Chris's point about support for it, at a time when we can't, as Americans, agree that the sky is blue, we do agree, we've done the polling to prove this, that across the political spectrum, folks believe that civic education is one of the top solutions to what ails our democracy. It's apple pie. Now, of course, we start to disagree when you drill down to what exactly we should be teaching as part of that civic education and how we should teach it. But we can compromise. That's part of our system. Disagreement, flaw, it's not a flaw, it's not a bug. It is a strength in our system. It's a feature of our democratic system. So we should lean into that. And something else, Chris, I love your point about, we can't go to the moon without a stable government. It's not just our democracy that requires our efforts right now. There is a national security imperative for civic education. There is an economic imperative for civic education. And just one little tidbit on the economic one. We have data showing that the states that had the strongest civic health, and there is something called the State Civic Health Index, the states that had the strongest civic health and the communities that had the strongest civic health weathered the 2008 financial crisis the best. They had the lowest level of unemployment, they had the best economic statistics. So stable, healthy democracy, stable, healthy civic cultures and communities is good for the economy.
I think education and the energy that we ought to devote, rather than at the national or even state level, it's an intensely local thing. And 80% of the American people think it ought to stay local. Here's a danger that I see. We agree on a lot of things here. I am very wary, however, of any involvement by the national government in civics. One of my favorite textbook titles ever is The Correct Textbook of History. This was issued by the ruling party in South Korea, not North Korea. And I think we're headed to a place, just look at the recent events where we had the previous president stand up a 1776 commission, only to have it dismantled on the first day of the current administration, replaced with a completely different standard. Where whatever we can say about the national legislation, that there's hedges and guardrails against it becoming a controlling mechanism, I think one of the reasons that we see civics right now in its dilapidated state is because of No Child Left Behind. The average school teacher in the elementary grades has 20 minutes because those tests that are mandated are in May, just as the judge noted. So there's a direct correlation, I believe, between federal interference and involvement in civics and how productive, how energetic, how great it really can be. And here's what I'd encourage you to think about. How at the local level can we build into schools? Yes, the funding is important, but the energy behind parents supporting teachers and teachers saying to the community, here's what we're doing. Please have our backs. Rather than the building principal or the superintendent or the legal counsel saying, let's try to stay away from those kind of topics, right? We don't really need to hear that. Come behind the teachers, come alongside them and say, we need this discussion. I think that would make a big difference. It'd make a big difference in this state. It'd make a big difference in Florida, because one of the things that we see across blue, red, and purple places is that parents are very wary of legislative control of the topics that kids and teachers are taking up in the schools. I think that wariness is warranted.
Verneé, I see you shaking your head. Did you?
Ditto. I'll just say that. I think, I'll say ditto.
A few things come to mind. The first is that I think it's important to recognize and agree with my colleague Emir that the state is where a lot of the action is in civics education. We'll build on that by noting engaging unlikely actors in supporting civics education at the state level can help to supercharge the progress and deepen the scope of ambassadors for civics. Generation Citizen recently put out a report on how secretaries of states can be champions for civics education, taking a case study approach to look at how in Rhode Island, in Minnesota, and in Kentucky, 3 different regions of the country, secretaries of state have gone beyond being referees and arbiters of election administration, voter education, voter turnout, et cetera, and instead have done things as varied as in Kentucky, doing a pilot program for civics education, to in Minnesota having a deep emphasis. Well, let me start with Rhode Island. The current Secretary of State was actually a champion, and we worked closely with him to draft and pass a civics education bill that provides access, particularly at the middle school level, to project-based civics education. And then in Minnesota, they have a deep emphasis in civics in classrooms as well as in communities. And so just want to lift up how not only in the education and local school system context, but there are also other actors in state government that can make a really huge difference. And then lastly, in New York State, the seal of civic readiness is something that's on the books here that is a key driver of momentum. It's optional for districts to raise their hands and take part. Those who have seen tons of momentum in places as varied as New York City to parts of Western New York. Buffalo is looking at leaning in particularly deep there. So there are things that can take place today to help move the needle forward.
You mind if I go back? I know I said ditto, and I am still there. I'm also a late processor. People who've been on panels with me know that. Give me a second. But I do want to think about what also just needs to happen at the local district level with superintendents as they are just looking at their system. And we tend to put civics in a box. Again, it's a classroom, it is a semester, but also part of civics education is what I would just call good teaching. Creating spaces where young people are able to be heard, where young people are able to talk across difference, where young people are able to speak and connect, and finding ways, and I think this can happen at the district level, and we've seen this. We don't have an advocacy arm as an organization. We are direct to teachers or direct to students. So we follow actually some of the folk here that help us think about where are the states that are ripe for civics education. But we also are able to work with superintendents who say, this is what I want in my district. I want my schools to be student-centered spaces where students are able to talk, where students are able to feel that the education that they have is relevant to what is happening. So I think there's an opportunity, and the way where we've been most successful is when districts have said, you're not just a curriculum, you're actually a way of helping us improve what's happening in our schools. I think Andrew said it, when we are listening to young people, and young people, I heard, again, Judge, you just were teeing me up. I had all kinds of notes. But you said children will listen, and I will also add, and want to be heard. And they want to figure out what are spaces. They know what's wrong with their schools. Ask them. We keep saying, why are students absent? They haven't come back since the pandemic. We put all these research studies. Did anybody ask the kids? Why aren't you going to school? What's happening? Why doesn't it feel relevant? As we talk about, by 12th grade, students have dropped out. We do all these studies to figure out why that's happening. Have we asked them? And when we ask them, and here in this state, we actually, in New York City, we work in New York City and Rochester, and we start with elementary school students. I've heard powerful speeches. We have a soapbox challenge where we ask students, what's the most important issue to you, and what do you think should be done about it? The best speeches I've heard are third graders. Ask them. Anybody who's a parent, ask your child. They have opinions. They know, they've done research behind it, and now they've got this technology that they can have information at their fingertips. Asking young people to be a part of the educational process, helping them feel engaged, actually improves what's happening within school systems. Those superintendents who are brave enough to ask questions, because then you get the answers. That's why you've got to be brave enough to ask the questions and get the answers, really start to have students feel more connected when you feel more engaged. And that's why we not just think about civic education, we think about civic engagement. They feel more engaged, they feel more valued, they feel the lessons are more relevant to them, they embrace the education more. They may challenge it a little more as well, but that's okay, as long as we feel supported in that. So while I do think it's important to look at federal government, state government, local government, I think as we think about school districts as sort of the institution, they're finding ways to make sure we've created an environment for young people to have access and feel connected in that individual space can open up a lot of doors to do this work.
Once again, Verneé getting me all fired up. I do appreciate it. Yeah, I couldn't agree more with all that. Ask the kids what they think. And if you're going to have a conversation with a young person about an election, don't make it about, who are you voting for, why you should be voting for this person. Ask them what they know, ask them what they've heard, ask them what they're thinking. Every year around elections, all the storylines are, young people are apathetic. Young people have apathy. That's not true. They care a whole lot. In fact, I would say they care a whole lot more at their age than previous generations did, than millennials, Gen Xers, et cetera. But can you really blame them for not super caring about this presidential election? Look at their choices. I'm not supposed to make political statements, but goodness. They care about a lot of things, they care about a lot of issues, but they don't have a dog in this fight. So don't think that because they don't care about the federal election, they don't care about what's happening in their schools, their communities, and maybe even their states. But since I'm an optimist, but I also am a contrarian. So I want to say that going back to this discussion of federal sort of intervention in civic education, I agree wholeheartedly with David Bobb. We do not need a federal civics mandate. But we do need a federal civics investment. Otherwise, STEM will continue to get all the federal dollars just as it has for the past 60 years. And so my friends have heard people from iCivics quote this stat a million times. The federal government invests $50 per year per student in STEM. And up until very recently, only 5 cents per student per year in civics. 5 cents to $50. You get what you pay for. Now, we worked really hard to move the needle, and we've, with some legislation, some of these appropriations that Andrew's talked about, we have what we consider a sort of down payment on democracy, but we need a whole lot more. So we won't back down on that. We do believe there needs to be more federal dollars infused into civic education. Guys, this goes back decades. In my mind, this goes back to 1957 and Sputnik, and our country, we freaked out. We had the National Defense of Education Act, first federal education legislation, and began a decades-long investment in STEM that later morphed into ELA, not morphed into, but also began to include with No Child Left Behind, Race to the Top, which if you hear me say all these pieces of legislation, what I hope you hear is that this isn't one party's fault, right? This has transcended political parties. We've all had a role to play in it. But my point is that it took us decades to get to this point. It's going to take us decades to get out. I keep hearing long game. I couldn't agree more. It's a long game. And you need to know when you're out there pushing for this long game that it's a hard argument to make. It's a hard case, and here's why. When the house is on fire, you want a hose. You want to put out the fire. Civic education is not the hose for the fire that seems to inflame our democracy right now. But there are a lot of efforts that are the hose. There are a lot of efforts that are seeking to sort of do things immediate that will have immediate effects. We should be investing in those and supporting those while concomitantly playing that long game and supporting the infrastructure so that our house is more safe from fires, can handle a fire, weather the storms.
It's amazing because, and I'm mindful of time because I want to make sure that we save at least a little bit of time for questions from the audience. But we're talking about opportunities that exist federal level, state level. Each of us has a rather, I'd say, unique perspective on what we've seen across the country. And before we turn to questions, I do want to get at least a little bit granular when it comes to the state. At the moment, you have most of the senior education officials in New York State, whether it's from the governor's office, the New York State Education Department, they're in the room because I see them, and I know many of them. If there's something that you would want to communicate specific to New York based on things that you've seen across the country, what is it that New York should take away? It's New York. It's a state that can move mountains in many ways. David?
I'll just point to a program that we did in Syracuse that I think is one of those indicators that that energy that comes from young people revolves around local problems, local solutions. We have a project-based learning contest really called My Impact Challenge. Students identify a problem that's in their local community and they seek to solve it. You know, the teenage impulse, like a lot of us, is to boil the ocean. And by asking them to think locally, great things can come from that. And we're seeing this sprout all across the country. Foundational knowledge plus the building of skills leads to dispositional change. So many of us, if we went around the room and asked, what's your civic spark? You know, there'd be great stories of models that you've looked to, things that energized you. And I guess if I had one word, it would be avoid the temptation to be overly prescriptive. Carve out room so that the local knowledge, the triangle of teachers, parents, and local administrators can be empowered to do the decision-making for their districts. Because things that come from this town and that come from Washington, D.C., unfortunately, do not have a track record of working in the way that we intend.
Amazing. Emma, Andrew, Verneé, go ahead.
Sure, yeah. So we talk a lot about civic deserts, places in our country where, and they tend to be rural, but that's not a rule, and I don't want to overgeneralize, but these civic deserts are places where folks, including young people, don't have a lot of opportunities to engage in civic life. I just spent last weekend in New York City. Oh my goodness, what a civic oasis. I mean, every corner I turned, I was just surrounded by community gardens. Oh my god, the parks, people walking everywhere, the mommy and me groups, and that's just like what you see, you know, around you on the streets, not even getting into what I know is extreme civic health of New York City. The problem is that not everyone in New York lives in New York City. And I'm not going to say that the rest of the state is a civic desert, but it's certainly not the oasis of New York City. And so what we have to be asking ourselves in New York is, how can we bring those experiences to other communities, to other students who are not in the city? And the answer is the classroom. Every student in New York, every young person in New York doesn't live in New York City, but they go to school every day, I hope. That's another conversation. But public education is what unites us. It's that shared opportunity. So we need to give them those civic opportunities in the classroom. Now, in a perfect world, these students would all have opportunities to participate in Generation Citizen and participate in the Mikva Challenge and have these really in-depth, transformative civic experiences. That's hard to scale. We're not going to see that in every classroom yet. So we have to do what we can, and that is classroom-based instruction using high-quality curriculum, high-quality instructional materials. I'll make one last point, which is this. You call any school district, call your kid's school and say, what's their English curriculum? They will tell you. And every teacher at that grade level in that school district is using that district-mandated high-quality curriculum. And I know it's high quality because, let me tell you, it wouldn't get purchased if it wasn't. There's a whole infrastructure there. Call and ask what their social studies curriculum is. Well, you know, we don't have one. We do not have that same kind of expectation of high quality instructional materials and core curriculum in social studies, and that is an issue of equity. And what it means is if you have an awesome social studies teacher, which I know a lot of the students in this room have, you're getting a high quality civic education. If you got the football coach who just has to teach one period, you're not. That's a problem. And so we need to also invest in not just these instructional mandates and instructional time, but also the high quality curriculum to support that time.
Andrew, Verneé.
Happy to hop in. One, just thrilled about this conversation. It's always a joy to have conversations about civics education, which I view as a matter of such great consequence, as do you, because we're all here dedicating the day to civics education. There was a report that the Civic Engagement Research Group put out on California State Seal of Civics Education. So I'm going to go to the West Coast in order to make my way back here to the Empire State. They articulated 3 things as key to effective seal implementation. The first is equitable access for districts of varying sizes up and down the length of not only the Golden State, but I suspect we could infer it here in the Empire State. Secondly, student voice, so that students are not only meeting the criteria of civic seals, but feel that their voice matters in conversation with their peers, in conversation with their teachers, that the activities that they're engaging in to meet the seal carry value and resonance. And then thirdly, funding to support districts adopting what may feel like yet another priority, to make sure that teachers can have the professional development support that they need to implement curriculum materials in an effective way, et cetera. In New York State, the one thing that I might give a hopefully benevolent nudge on is I think the funding dimension would be ideal for districts to have more access to. There just so happens to be a bill by Assemblymember Conrad that would I'll be succinct, Chris, I promise. Allocate $50,000 to up to 20 districts to help support leaning into matters of student voice, leaning into questions of equity. And that, I think, could help consolidate some of the phenomenal progress that's already in place in New York State for the Seal of Civic Readiness, as well as help diffuse that progress throughout more districts.
I'll just thank you for that. Again, ditto to everything that was said here. I'll just amplify two things. One, the civic seal, the New York State has a civic seal, so finding ways to make sure that schools know about it, know what it requires. But I will say the biggest risk and biggest threat that our organization is facing, and again, here in New York, we work in New York City and we work in Rochester. In both of those cities, schools have said, principals, district administrators, superintendent, the chancellor of New York City Public Schools, as well as mainly principals and district reps in Rochester have said, we want to do this work. It has a cost, though. And in both places, there's a ton of COVID dollars that has come down. Schools have been able to use that money over the last few years to help support the professional development of teachers, which is important in order to execute the curriculum. Those dollars are drying up. And so we are finding in both regions that we may be at risk when schools have said, principals have said, administrators have said, we want you, but we're struggling to figure out how to pay for you. So we're fundraising through, lots of different channels to keep our curriculum and our professional development and our work in schools, but money talks. So if we're going to say, what is our need here in New York, a priority for civic education, but also making sure that districts understand that where they can get those funds from. There's philanthropy in this area, and people have expressed interest. If we just went on demand alone, we'd be in a lot more schools than we're in, because the demand is there. People have seen the product and they believe in it. It is figuring out how to make sure that they can afford the use of it, and particularly the training that is the barrier.
I love this, and before I turn over to questions, I love the conversation on funding. And just as a kind of comical side note, my first day as Assistant Counsel for Education, I was invited to go look at the computer that gives out state aid in New York, and anybody here who knows about state education aid is going to probably crawl under the desk, only because of the complications that come. And I remember very specifically saying, I do not want to see the computer in the basement of the Capitol building, because I was afraid, even being in the room, I would break it. And that computer, as many people here knows, distributes billions and billions and billions of dollars of state aid in a formula that all of maybe half a person understands. It's part of what makes New York unique. I'm so glad that each of you is here. We have a few minutes left. Are there questions from the audience that we can take while we have everybody up here? Please. And I think there's a microphone right in the middle.
Ask a question. So make a case for civics education, and it's assumed, I think, that it supports democracy, but it just seems to me if you want to make a case for civics, you have to back it out not only to democracy, but also to why people should care about democracy. And I think you have to then go back to what people value regarding their own interests, self-interest, and there's societal interest, which I back that out to the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. But I guess my question is, can we make the case for civics something that's more palpable for people, more that they have an emotional, yes, we need civics because it'll help us and our local community, for example.
Oh, I
You
love
know,
that.
I'll say, I know exactly what I always say. I always say it's in the preamble. Civics is what allows us to create a more perfect union. Civics is what allows us to continue to try to do better, even though we don't always do better. Civics is what allows us to come together and talk about difficult topics. Civics is what gives us those tools, and it gives us those tools in a way that completely puts aside partisan questions, and there's not a lot that does that, right?
That's correct. Yeah, go ahead, David.
No, I think you're absolutely right to point us to the fact that
Great point.
we can't think only in abstractions, especially when you're a young person, right? The totemic words that are here in this great hall, justice, rule of law, right, the common good, these are important things that take a long time to understand. I'll go back again to the modeling. You know, several people have brought up the important point of what do we do with our small d democratic learning? Think of what most student councils are entrusted to do. Choose the band for the prom and the day that pizza is going to be served. That doesn't inspire self-government, right? Think of how our school board deliberation goes. We have people like us sit here in a panel and listen to 3-minute speeches without any interchange. That's not deliberation. So there's many things that I think we need to think about in terms of governance that bring these principles to bear directly on the lives of young people so that they see that civics is about the future and that they are the drivers of that future.
I'll just add the end of our mission statement. Our mission statement is, at Mikva Challenge, our mission is to develop young people to be empowered, informed, and active civic leaders. And then we added a sentence at the end, to promote a just and equitable society. And so as we think about, you know, our democracy and the work that we do, it is really with that mission, with that goal, that we are educating young people who will play their role in promoting a just and equitable society, which to me is a huge need and a part of our democracy.
Please.
Hi, I'm Liliana Jones. I'm a student from Bethlehem High School, and my question for you is, what is the most important foundation that is missing in civic education, and what would you like to see being taught as that foundation?
Oh, I'm gonna need a second. I need processing time. That's such a good question. I mean, you know, logistically, we just need more time. Students spend, 13 years learning math, learning science, learning English language arts, and that 13-year span, they get maybe a total of 4 or 5 years of social studies. It's not enough time. But I think, to merge your question with the gentleman's question, it's that education in democracy and why it matters. That's the full foundation. If all you know about democracy is what you see on the cable news TV screen at the dentist's office or when you visit your grandparents, you're not going to think it's the best form of government. And you might not understand what the alternatives are and why they're not good alternatives. So I think we need the time to teach about democracy and to make it relevant.
How would you like that to be taught? Like, how should that be taught in a classroom?
I mean, I realize you can't see what we do by looking at us, but yeah, I'll let other people talk. What we do, I think, is truly.
Sure, happy to respond to that, in part at least. One engaging way, and I say one because there's several engaging ways, but one engaging way to go about doing civics so that it produces some of what you're talking about is to have students converse among themselves with the support of teachers, and to have students create constitutions, rules of the road for a conversation. How will we disagree? How will we select issues that are of greatest importance to us? Once we select those issues, how will we create an action plan of what we want to do to accomplish the solution that we want to see based on the problem that we selected? And then after selecting that solution, this is the process that we do called Action Civics, and I know Mikva Challenge does something similar. How can we call our elected officials, appointed officials, and engage them as co-solutionists so that we can make progress on the issues that we've selected? So essentially a more interactive and participatory process that blends analysis with engagement.
Thank you.
To take that just one quick step further, maybe find somebody at your school with whom you might disagree or that you think you might have a disagreement. And instead of avoiding it, go right there and have a conversation. Be curious. If we did more of that, one by one, school by school, I think we'd find that the foundations can be laid more effectively.
And I'd say one of those powerful conversations I've ever had in a classroom was when I had two students come to me and say, we fundamentally disagree about something, and they fundamentally disagreed about something. And they said, but our friendship matters more than us not agreeing on this. What do you think we can do? And I remember that because I remember it was one of those moments as an educator where I just became tunnel vision. We've all had this, and I'm just like, everybody else, I need to handle this. And we just talked. And we talked about intellectual humility and not talking across each other, but with each other. And I actually checked in. Years later, they're friends. They're both at different colleges. They do not agree on a lot. But I'm so proud that they've actually modeled that. And that's not easy to do. But that's what the topic that we do in civics requires us to do. Not the easy stuff. Not that math is easy. But this can be really hard. Really hard. That's a great question. And we have time for one more, so please.
Okay. Hi, so my name is Rue. I'm also a student at Bethlehem Central, and this is also kind of like to also lead in from Liliana's original question, but I guess it's like, what do you think is like the best way to encourage more like democratic / like civil arguments, not just like in the classroom, but also just as a principle in general? Because I've seen often on like social media and like other like sort of like platforms, for example, where it's like, they don't actually ever get into that sort of like civil discussion. They just kind of like almost state their opinions and just end it there while also just like pitting it head to head. There's never that sort of like kind of attempt at like a mutual understanding. So I feel like that's just like something that's really important to like kind of like emphasize just like throughout. And I was wondering if you guys had like any like ideas or like kind of to encourage that like just like throughout.
I'll just say there, civic skills are important. Listening, learning, absorbing information, understanding perspective. Those things aren't necessarily, people will say, oh, those are soft skills, but those aren't necessarily things that are in a textbook. But I think finding space, it's really easy to get behind a video, spout something and walk away and say, oh, I've contributed. But really being intentional about speaking and listening is something that can be fostered in a classroom or an after-school space. And so being part of groups or organizations that will allow the nurturing of those, listening, speaking, facilitation, gaining perspective, arguing skills, researching, understanding. And so finding, again, it's very hard to do this because the platforms don't create those spaces, but I think in classrooms, whether it's K-12 or university, there are those spaces to listen, be heard, argue, talk across difference, come back and be in alignment. So I think getting off those platforms is a piece, and I won't say exclusively, but finding ways to be in a dialogue versus a one-sided conversation.
Briefly, because I can hear the orchestra start to play. I love that you use the word arguments. People will say, we argue too much, we're yelling too much. Our good friend Eric Liu in the civic field, he would say, actually, arguments are okay. It's not that we need to have less arguments, we just need to have better arguments. And there's rules for this. So everyone go to betterargumentsproject.com. I don't know all the rules, but the first one is my favorite. Take winning off the table. When you enter an argument or you enter a discussion, don't try to win. Try to listen, try to understand the person's point of view. Thanks for your question.
Yeah, thanks so much.
That was beautiful. Thank you, everybody, for...
We're going to take a break in a moment, but I want to just say a few things. First of all, Christopher, you've assembled an incredible panel here, and as always, you've enhanced this experience a great deal. What a great group. Secondly, I want to acknowledge the New York State Bar Foundation for their support of this program. They contribute to and have contributed to thousands of different organizations and families and helped them through some very difficult times and have really made a mark. And they are a big supporter of this this particular program. And thirdly, I want to follow up on one of the things that this young lady brought up and what Christopher said. It's not just students who are being torn apart, their friendships, but it's families. It's, I mean, there are places, there are cocktail parties that you don't want to go to because of what's going to happen. So that I think is also very important. And the last thing I want to say is that Andrew Brown and I were talking as these two young ladies got up and spoke. And when I was their age, you couldn't have dragged me up there with horses. So all I want to do is encourage them to continue to speak, continue to ask questions, and continue to do what you're doing. We're going to take a 15-minute break. Thank you.